The world grows quiet, and the story begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Sounds of Stories. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Sounds of Stories. Tonight, our journey doesn't begin with a murder or a chase or even a crime. It begins with something so ordinary that almost no one notices it. And that's exactly where the greatest mysteries like to hide. Now, let the pages turn. The Society of Quiet Clerks, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. The Society of Quiet Clerks. The Invitation. I had been at Baker Street 3 days before the affair of the Society of Quiet Clerks came to my attention, and I confess that when it did, I felt none of the urgency that sometimes seizes me in the presence of genuine mystery. It appeared, at first encounter, to be merely peculiar, a quality London produces in great quantity and which rarely repays serious examination. The client was a small, precise man named Elias Pembroke, who kept a stationery shop in Clerkenwell and wore his respectability like a man wearing borrowed clothes, carefully, self-consciously, with constant small adjustments. He sat in Holmes's chair and produced from his inside pocket a folded advertisement, which he spread upon his knee with the reverence of a man presenting evidence at his own trial. "I found it in the Illustrated London News," he said, 3 weeks ago. I nearly did not respond." Holmes took it without looking at it. He was looking at Pembroke. "But you did respond," Holmes said, "and you were hired immediately." "How did you even—" "Your cuffs," Holmes said. "The right one shows ink stains of a particular distribution. Not the broad smear of a man who writes for commerce, but the precise lateral stain of someone who has been copying. Copying at length and recently. The callus on your middle finger has developed within the last month. Whatever you've been doing, you began doing it within the last 4 weeks, and it involved a great deal of handwriting." He finally looked at the advertisement. "The Society of Quiet Clerks. What did they require of you?" "Perfect copperplate," he said, "which I have. They tested it on the spot, gave me a paragraph, and watched. Then they asked me to report each weekday morning to an office in Bartholomew Lane from 9 o'clock until 1. I was to copy old shipping manifests, ledgers going back 30 years. They said they were compiling an archive." He paused. "The pay was extraordinary. 3 times what I earn at the shop in a week for 4 hours of copying." "And the conditions?" Pembroke ticked them on his fingers. "Never ask questions about the purpose of the work. Never speak to other clerks. There were 4 of us beyond what was strictly necessary. Never leave the room during hours. Never carry notes or copies out of the office. Never arrive late or depart early. And," he hesitated, "never look at the windows." "Never look at the windows?" I repeated. "There were 2 facing the street. We were told they admitted too high light and disturbed the copying. We were keeping our eyes on the page." He paused again. "I thought it odd. I still think it odd. But 3 weeks passed without incident, and I had nearly ceased wondering about it." "And then?" Holmes said. "And then, this morning I arrived and the office was empty." He said it simply, without drama, which made it more effective. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Empty?" "Entirely. No furniture, no ledgers, no other clerks, no employer. Mr. Caulfield had managed the office, a tall man I never once saw without gloves. Gone. Everything gone." Pembroke set his hat on his knee. "Except one thing." From his breast pocket, he produced an envelope. It was fine cream stock, the sort Pembroke himself would have sold, and across its face, in a hand of remarkable elegance, were written 3 words. "To whoever notices." Holmes took the envelope and turned it over twice. He didn't open it, though. Instead, he set it on the mantelpiece with a deliberateness that told me he considered it the most important object in the room. "Mr. Pembroke," he said, "was there anything else you noticed about the office during your 3 weeks of employment?" Pembroke thought. "The floor," he said at last. "Once about 10 days ago, I dropped my pen and it rolled toward the back wall. When I retrieved it, I noticed the floorboards near the skirting were newer than the rest, cleaner, as though they had been replaced recently." Holmes smiled. It was the smile I had learned to recognize, not of pleasure exactly, but of appetite. "Watson," he said, not taking his eyes from the envelope, "someone wanted this found." He picked it up and opened it at last. Inside was a single sheet of the same cream stock, entirely blank. He smiled again, more broadly. "Even better," he said. Chapter 2. Beneath Ordinary Streets. The False Mystery. We went to Bartholomew Lane the following morning, Holmes and I, and found it precisely as Pembroke had described. An ordinary Georgian office building, the rooms on the second floor stripped to bare boards and bare walls, with only the ghost of furniture in the dust. Holmes spent 40 minutes examining the room with the methodical patience that I had long ceased to find tedious and had come to regard as a kind of meditation. He measured distances with a pocket tape. He examined the newer floorboards. He opened the sash windows, the ones the clerk had been forbidden to face, and looked down into the lane below for a long time without speaking. "What do you see?" I asked. "A tobacconist," he said, "a solicitor's practice, a cart selling jellied eels, and the rear service entrance of the Bartholomew branch of the London Continental Bank directly below." I joined him at the window. He was right. The bank's service yard was plainly visible, the loading dock, the coal chute, the iron door that would lead to the vaults. "The clerks were kept from the windows," I said slowly, "so they could not see that." "So they couldn't see it, and couldn't later testify to having seen it," Holmes agreed. He dropped back to the newer floorboards and crouched, pressing the boards with his palm. "There's a void beneath here, significant depth." He rose. "A tunnel, Watson. Someone has been digging." I felt the familiar quickening that attends a discovery in these affairs. But Holmes's expression was not that of a man who has found his answer. It was the expression of a man who suspects he is being shown one. We called next at the stationery shop in Clerkenwell, Pembroke's shop, and I confess I expected nothing further of interest there. It was a modest establishment, a brass bell, glass-fronted cases of correspondence paper, a rack of pen nibs, the smell of ink and dust that seems to attend all such places, as though it has soaked into the walls across the decades. The assistant appeared from the back, a lean young man of perhaps 25, with quick, educated eyes, and the quality I've noticed in certain men of good breeding who have chosen, for whatever reason, to occupy a position beneath their natural station. He gave me his name as Kettridge and said he had worked for Pembroke for 4 months. Holmes spoke to him briefly and with apparent indifference about nothing in particular, the quality of the morning, the volume of custom in Clerkenwell. It was the sort of idle conversation that Holmes was remarkably capable of producing when he required a man's guard to drop. As he left, Holmes said nothing for an entire block. Then, his hands. I noticed nothing in particular. That's because you were looking at his face, which is where he intended you to look. His hands carry a reddish clay beneath the nails, not garden clay, not builder's clay, the clay of the London basin at a depth of 12 to 15 feet. He has been digging, Watson. At night, I think, given the freshness of it. Holmes paused. He's also left-handed, Oxford educated, has spent time in Cape Colony. The tan on his forearms ends precisely at the point where a colonial working shirt would have, and is very deliberately performing the role of someone less intelligent than he is. "The tunnel," I said. "He's been digging the tunnel." Almost certainly. Holmes stopped walking entirely. He turned to face me with an expression I recognized with some difficulty because it was not one he wore often. It was uncertainty, or perhaps, more precisely, deliberate suspension of judgment. "The Earth interests me very little, Watson," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "The tunnel, the bank, the vault beneath Bartholomew Lane. It is all very well constructed, and I do not doubt for a moment that Kettridge, or whatever his name actually is, has been digging his way toward a quantity of someone else's money with considerable industry." He began walking again. "But I keep returning to those manifests." "The shipping manifests that Pembroke and the other clerks were copying?" "Yes, old manifests," Pembroke said. 30 years old. And yet someone was willing to pay 3 times a craftsman's weekly wage for their reproduction. He pulled his coat collar up against the October wind. "Why does one copy a thing?" "To have a record of it. Or," Holmes said, "to replace it." I turned that over in my mind as we walked back toward the Strand. And as we walked, I noticed something I might otherwise have dismissed. On 3 separate lampposts, on a pillar box, and on the door of a corn chandler's, there were pinned small squares of paper, handwritten notes, each in an elegant copper plate I was beginning to recognize. I pointed them out to Holmes. He read one and showed nothing on his face. "How long has London been receiving those, I wonder?" he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Chapter 3. The Correspondence Nobody Questions. The Invisible Crime. Holmes spent 3 days investigating the memoranda, and during those 3 days he seemed to forget entirely about the tunnel. Inspector Athelney Jones called us on the second day, having heard from some source that Holmes's sources and Jones's sources were overlapped in ways neither man was comfortable acknowledging. That something was afoot near Bartholomew Lane. He sat in the basket chair and listened with barely concealed impatience while Holmes described his findings. "With respect, Mr. Holmes, I have a tunnel, I have a bank, and I have a man with clay on his boots. I think the path forward is fairly clear." "The path you describe," Holmes said, "leads to one bank robbery. The path I'm following leads somewhere considerably more interesting." "And what path is that?" Holmes held up one of the small handwritten notes. He'd collected 11 of them from various points across the city. "In the past 3 months, these memoranda have appeared at regular intervals throughout the commercial district of London. They instruct variously a coal merchant to delay a shipment by 4 days, a freight agent to reroute a consignment of dry goods from Bristol to Plymouth, a warehouse manager to hold a particular bill of lading in his private safe rather than file it with the others." "Instructions from whom?" Jones asked. "That is exactly the question. I have now spoken to 7 of the recipients. In each case, the memorandum bears a signature. The signature of a genuine identifiable individual. A partner, a superior, a man of recognized authority within the relevant business." Holmes paused. "And in each case, the individual whose signature appears has no memory of writing the note nor any knowledge of the instruction it contains." Jones stared. "Forgeries?" "The most extraordinary forgeries I have ever encountered. I took 3 of them to Hansworth, a documents examiner at the Inns of Court, and he spent 4 hours on them. His verdict? Genuine. The ink, the paper stock, the precise formation of every letter. He can't call anything but authentic." "Then the signatories are lying." "None of them have any motive to lie. 2 are aware that following the instructions caused them financial inconvenience. They are as puzzled as we are." There was a silence. Jones, to his credit, was thinking. "How are they delivered?" he asked. "Nobody knows. They appear. A clerk finds one on a desk. A manager discovers one beneath his door. A warehouseman arrives in the morning to find one pinned beside his timesheet." Holmes steepled his fingers. "London has apparently grown accustomed to receiving instructions from anonymous sources. The commercial world runs on paper, on directives, on the unquestioned authority of the written word." These notes are indistinguishable from legitimate business correspondence, and so they are obeyed without question. It is not forgery in the conventional sense, Jones. It is something cleverer. It's the exploitation of trust." Jones left unconvinced, and I understood his position. The tunnel was real, solid, provable. Holmes's memoranda were a ghost story, an invisible crime committed against the ordinary habits of London commerce. But that night, Holmes sat until 3 a.m. with the 11 notes spread across the desk, and when I came down to fetch water and found him there, he looked up with an expression I could only describe as the resolution of a very difficult calculation. "Watson," he said, "do you know what the shipping manifests from 30 years ago were actually used for?" "In Pembroke's copying? No." "Neither do I," Holmes said, "yet, but I know what they're not used for. They were not used for an archive." He looked back at the notes. "Someone has been rewriting history, very slowly, very carefully, and only one document at a time." Chapter 4. The Perfect Diversion. Everything clicks. Holmes said nothing more on the subject for 2 days, which I had learned to read not as absence of progress, but as its opposite. Those silences were when he moved fastest. On the 3rd day, he took me to the city, to a narrow lane near Bishopsgate, where a firm of shipping agents occupied the ground floor of a building whose upper floors showed signs of recent renovation. He showed the proprietor, a stout, suspicious man named Grundy, one of the handwritten memoranda. Grundy's face went pale. "Where did you get that?" he said. "I found it," Holmes said pleasantly. "You received one like it?" Grundy retrieved a folder from his cabinet with the reluctance of a man producing evidence against himself. Inside were 3 memoranda in the same elegant copperplate hand, each instructing him to transfer the record of ownership of specific cargo consignments. Consignments from decades ago, now relevant only to questions of inheritance and property law from one archived register to another. "Did you obey the instructions?" Holmes said. "I did. They bore Mr. Fairchild's signature, my senior partner. I had no reason to—" "Of course not." Holmes was already reading those notes with an intensity that excluded the rest of the room. Then he set them down. "Mr. Grundy, do you know a firm called the Meridian Import Consortium?" Grundy blinked. "I've heard of it. American film, I believe. Been acquired interests in London shipping houses for the past 6 months." "For the past 6 months," Holmes repeated softly. "Yes, that would be consistent." In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes sat with his hat pulled low and his hands folded and said nothing until we crossed the Waterloo Bridge, and then he said, "The tunnel was bait, Watson." I waited. "Not bait for us, bait for the police. A tunnel to a bank vault is irresistible to Scotland Yard. It's tangible, it's exciting, it gives a man something to watch. While Jones watches the tunnel and the newspapers prepare to celebrate the exposure of a bold robbery, the actual business, the patient, invisible, deeply boring business, continues uninterrupted." The memoranda and the copied manifests. Do you see it now, Watson? The Society of Quiet Clerks existed to produce, over the course of weeks, in the hands of innocent copyists who could later swear they were merely duplicating old records, a set of shipment documents that didn't previously exist. Not quite forgeries, not quite fraud. A quiet rewriting of what the records say happened to cargo that moved through London 30 years ago. Cargo that established at the time certain rights of ownership that have since been valuable, because the Meridian Import Consortium intends to claim them. I turned it over carefully. "So what you're saying, Holmes, is you're saying the manifests... They established that certain shipment interests belonged 30 years ago to a company whose assets were subsequently absorbed by a company whose assets were subsequently acquired by the Meridian Import Consortium, which is to say, by the men running this scheme." The memoranda redirected current documentation to make the paper trail coherent. Everything authentic on its face. Everything consistent with the archive. Holmes leaned his head back. They never intended to steal a pound from the London Continental Bank. The vault beneath Bartholomew Lane is theater, Watson. A very expensive, very convincing piece of theater designed to ensure that when the scheme is eventually noticed, which is always meant to be, everyone will look at the tunnel. A long silence filled the cab. "And the envelope," I said, "to whoever notices, that was meant to be found too?" "Left for the one person in London likely to follow the more interesting thread rather than the obvious one," Holmes said. "An invitation. Whoever arranged this, and I have a good idea who it was, wanted an audience for the real trick. Perhaps they even wanted a witness. The tunnel's the kind of crime that gets a man hanged. The rewriting of 30-year-old cargo records is the kind of crime that is very nearly impossible to prosecute." He smiled thinly. "It was flattery, Watson. Someone has been flattering me." Chapter 5. Holmes explains almost nothing. The real solution. Kettridge, along with 2 other men, were arrested in the tunnel at 11:30 that night. All 3 covered in London basin clay and within 4 feet of the vault wall. Jones was enormously satisfied. He shook Holmes's hand on the pavement and said it was a fine night's work, and the newspapers the next morning would have agreed with him. The Meridian Insort Consortium quietly dissolved 3 days later. Its principals were not in England. The rewritten manifests and the rerouted records were never formally presented in any court, because the men who would have presented them had departed for the continent on what their remaining associates described as a long-planned business journey. Holmes read the shipping news for a week, and then he stopped. Pembroke came to Baker Street to thank him, having received a sum of money from an anonymous source which more than compensated him for the loss of his extraordinary wages. He shook my hand warmly, and Holmes with great ceremony, and departed with his hat held against his chest, looking like a man who has survived something he doesn't entirely understand and is grateful for the fact. When he had gone, I sat down and looked at Holmes across the cold fireplace. "Was it really about the tunnel?" I asked. Holmes said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the blank envelope, still on the mantelpiece, the most important object in the room. "No, Watson," he said. I waited. "The tunnel merely gave London something interesting to watch." I thought of Jones, beaming on the pavement, of the morning papers, of the straightforward narrative of crime and detection that the public had already accepted and would never revise. "Then what became of those memoranda?" I asked. "The records they established, the manifests Pembroke copied. Are they simply out there? Somewhere in some archive establishing rights that someone might yet attempt to claim?" Holmes picked up his pipe. He turned it in his hands without filling it. "Yes, and that's exactly what was always intended," he said. "Which is what precisely?" He looked at me for a moment with an expression I found difficult to read, something between amusement and a genuine and uncharacteristic reluctance. "That," he said, "is a question I find I prefer to leave open." He rose, went to the window, and looked out at Baker Street below. The evening traffic moved in its usual way. The lampmen were making their rounds, and somewhere down the street a barrel organ was playing a waltz, thin and jaunty in the cold air. "There's one thing that still interests me," I said, though I knew I'd get nothing useful. "Really? Only one?" he said without turning. "The handwriting. In the memoranda, in the envelope address, the same hand throughout. Who was it?" A long pause. "Very good copperplate," Holmes said quietly. "Perfect copperplate, in fact. The kind a man develops after a lifetime of practice." He turned from the window. "Or after 3 weeks of copying shipping manifests 8 hours a day." He picked up his violin and drew the bow across the strings. a single clear note that hung in the room long after it should have faded. He did not explain himself any further. He never did. And I, sitting in my chair with a cold pipe and a great deal to think about, found that for once I preferred it that way. And there you have it, everyone. In the end, Holmes wasn't chasing a criminal mastermind hidden in the shadows. He was uncovering a truth hidden in plain sight. That the most effective secrets are often protected not by elaborate schemes, but by ordinary routines that no one thinks to question. The story actually closes with an editor's note that I'll read to you, and I think that it captures its spirit perfectly. The editor's note states, "Several readers have written to ask whether Dr. Watson's account bears resemblance to certain other celebrated mysteries." To that, Mr. Holmes, when asked, merely replied, "There are only so many ways to hide the truth." I love that ending, because it reminds us that every great mystery builds on the same simple idea. The truth is often visible from the very beginning. The challenge isn't finding it, it's recognizing its importance before someone else does. Now, if you enjoyed this journey, you'll find many more classic tales as well as other audiobooks waiting for you at thesoundsofstories.com. You can type it in or click the link in the description below. And thanks for spending your time here with us at The Sounds of Stories. Come back for another adventure. And remember, when the world seems to fade, the stories always remain.